My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books for Magic. Thank you. No, you're good. We are so excited to have Heather McGhee and Frederick Joseph here with us tonight to celebrate the launch of the new Young Readers adaptation of Heather's incredible book, The Sum of Us. But before you get into all of that, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, for all of you out in the audience, we do ask that you keep your mask on at all times at this event. We have plenty of extras up at the front where you checked in if you need one. We will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of tonight's discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Heather will be personalizing books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of The Sum of Us online using the link in the live stream description. All right, so let's get into this. The Sum of Us, for those who haven't yet read it, explores the costs of racism through the lens of economy and policy. It is a truly eye-opening read for anyone living in America in these times, and with this new adaptation, we are so excited to be able to bring the young readers and thinkers of the next generation into this extremely important conversation. Needless to say, we can't wait to hear what Heather and Fred have to say about it tonight. Heather McGhee is an expert in economic and social policy, along with writing The Sum of Us, which was long-listed for the National Book Award. She has drafted legislation, testified before Congress, and contributed regularly to news shows. She now chairs the Board of Color of Change, the nation's largest online racial justice organization. And as I mentioned before, Frederick Joseph joins Heather in conversation tonight. Fred is a two-time New York Times bestselling author of The Black Friend and Patriarchy Blues, and the author of Better Than We Found It. He has received a number of awards and recognitions, including the International Literacy Association's 2021 Children's and Young Adults Book Award, and the 2018 Comic-Con Humanitarian of the Year Award. All right, that's all for me. Without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Fred and Heather.
Well, let me just say, first of all, welcome to those in the room and to those online. It's really a pleasure. Thank you so much to the Books Are Magic team. This is a beautiful, wonderful bookstore. It's distracting how many gorgeous titles there are. The energy and vibe in here is fabulous, and they put on wonderful events. So support your local independent bookstores, including one I just learned about called Ripped Bodice, which is an all-romance bookstore in Los Angeles, whose owner is here in the audience today. Support all your indie bookstores, support them early and often. And to Frederick, thank you so much for doing this conversation with me. Let's get into it.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, the pleasure is absolutely mine. So much of your work has absolutely influenced my work. And, you know, I know that you wanted to start out with a passage, so why don't we dig into that so we can make sure we can all get home after braving the snow.
Yeah. So speaking of snow, I'm going to read this part that takes place in Maine. You know, this is my first in-person bookstore event for the young readers version, but also period, because I released the adult version in the pandemic. So I've done, you know, probably 1,000 different book talks, but none of them has been just like in a bookstore, which is what I envisioned when I wrote a book. So this is really special. So I was like, oh, I want to read. Like, that's what you're supposed to do at a bookstore. You're supposed to read your book. Okay, so here's just a little bit. It's the opening of chapter 10, which is called The Solidarity Dividend. I parked in a vacant lot on the southernmost end of Lisbon Street, the main thoroughfare of Lewiston, Maine. The street dead ends near the old canal, built to power the cotton mills that made Lewiston one of the more prosperous towns in America in the late 1800s. The mills, the prosperity, even much of the canal are now gone. Dying mill towns like Lewiston have been ground zero for propagation of the zero-sum story. Lewiston was once great for its white residents and began to fall apart in the same era when civil rights were on the rise and the country grew more diverse. Progress for people of color means a loss for white people. But this equation adds up only if you leave out the decisions by corporate employers to seek cheaper labor or the trade policies that were the final death knell in the 1990s and 2000s. Actually, I do want to read that. I was like, I'll skip that part. No. Maine is the state with the whitest and oldest population in the country, whose children are the least likely in the country to have a classmate of color. The state ranks among the top 10 in opioid deaths. From 2011 to 2019, the state's right-wing governor, Paul LePage, campaigned and governed on rhetoric about illegal immigrants on welfare and drug-dealing people of color. Meanwhile, he vetoed Medicaid expansion for the working class 5 times and delivered large tax cuts for the wealthy. I traveled to Lewiston because of the ways its residents are especially vulnerable to the zero-sum story, but also because of a promising phenomenon I saw signs of about 10 minutes into my walk up the town's main street. At the beginning of my walk, many of the buildings I saw stood stately and vacant, with neatly boarded up windows on the ground floor. But once I crossed Chestnut Street, Lisbon Street came alive. Windows were suddenly stacked high with goods, framed by posters for mobile wire transfers and prepaid cards. One store had an arresting display of kaftans and hijabs in bright, coordinated colors. Another, next to the shadow of a faded old grocery store sign, had a sign reading Mogadishu Business Center. The shop offered groceries, a restaurant, money transfer, a seamstress, a tax preparer, cleaning service, halal meat, and sweet, strong coffee, as I learned when I stopped in to fuel up. The door chimes marked my departure from the street into a warm, fragrant, and music-filled shop. In the aisle near a wall of bulk spices, I saw 2 men and a young boy speaking in a language I recognized as Somali. As I ordered my coffee from the young hijab-wearing woman behind the counter, we chatted about how long she'd been in Maine, 7 years, the weather, what good comes from complaining, and after my first sip, the spices in my coffee. A secret blend, but yes, cardamom. I exited the Somali shop and looked around at the white and black residents on the street with a smile. Maybe these somewhat accidental neighbors were destined to create another story, a different formula from the zero sum, one more fitting for our future as a nation of many.
I absolutely love that because it perfectly demonstrates why I'm asking my first question.
All right.
So, one of the things I think that you've done with your book better than probably anyone thus far is weave in historical context with current happenings, right? And obviously using economic despair of this country. What made you focus on the economy as your theory of change in your work?
That's a great question. I think I really owe a lot to when and where I grew up. So I was born in 1980, which is really the beginning of the inequality era, right? It's Reagan's first year in office. It's sort of the crystallization of a kind of bipartisan neoliberal way of, making sense of the economy and, of course, of policy. You begin to see the rich, their fortunes really kind of just depart from everybody else's. You see massive cutbacks in government spending that really impacted the Black community where I lived on the south side of Chicago, because so many of my family and my neighbors' jobs were in the public sector, because the public sector, had anti-discrimination laws before the private sector. And then, of course, you saw the trade policies and the loss of manufacturing jobs on the south side. And so I think I really was the kind of kid, and I just met some of them this morning when I did a book event at a middle school, and I was like, I see you, I was you, who was asking why, right? Was like, why is this happening? Why do I see the difference between these two neighborhoods? Why? Why? And I was really lucky because my mom, Gail Christopher, was somebody who answered with structural reasons. She was talking about Reagan. She was talking about the budget. She was talking about welfare reform in the 90s and things like that. And so I was really interested in the economy, and I think also a little bit of me wanted to do the hard thing. Yeah. Right? It was like, there wasn't usually somebody who looked like me in the economic policy tables where I was in my 20s and 30s when I worked at Demos, the think tank that I ultimately led for 4 years. I wasn't even good at math, but I ended up, being somebody who was talking about economic data and who was using it to make arguments that were ultimately moral arguments, right, about the minimum wage and about, what we owe to one another and the dignity of work and all of that. But I wanted to kind of like be where the self-satisfied smart guys were, and like use their tools to try to work for the kinds of communities that I saw being left out.
Yeah, and you've done such a brilliant job of that, right? When we're talking in the back, one of the things that I was offered through Heather's work is this idea of the return on investment for progress, right? So when you go into certain spaces, and many of them you've been in, and many of us in this room have been in, people are like, well, what's the point, right? As we talk about not just racial equity and racial progress, as we talk about progress for people from all sorts of identities. And in that, right, my question for you is, what do you hope, right, in that return on investment for progress that young people take away, right? Because we've done the work for old people like myself. What do you want the young people to take away, though?
So when the adult book first came out, and I was, doing my virtual tours, which, in some, they have their benefits. People are in the chat with you, everybody gets to say something to you in the chat of the Zoom and then the YouTube and everything. One of the most common things people said was, I wish I'd read this earlier in my life. This should be required reading. And I was thinking about sort of why that was. Part of it may be the racism has a cost for everyone. We have a mutual stake in combating racism. But I actually think it was, which is like the big thesis, but I actually think it was something I included in the book because I needed to figure it out, which was I spent nearly 20 years in economic policy working on the product of bad economic decision making and trying to use public policy tools and research to counter, issues of poverty and the lack of public investment and, low workers' rights and, the high cost of college and all these different things. But I actually didn't have, even as I was a so-called expert, I didn't have a really good historical understanding of how we'd gotten here, right? I mean, how did the country that was, that invented the American dream end up having one of the highest levels of inequality of our peer economies? Like, how did we get there? And so by finding this kind of unified theory of the case, that it was drained pool politics, that it was racism which created a trap door underneath what had been this sort of strong safety net for a mostly white America, it really was like a big aha, and in very simple terms, understanding the historical and structural reasons why we're so messed up, why there's so much inequality, why we can't have nice things, as I say at the opening of the book, right? Nice things like universal childcare and paid family leave and a well-funded public school in every neighborhood, right? Understanding the structural whys helps really counteract the stereotypes, right? I mean, when I was growing up, the narrative about why the South Side of Chicago was poor was that there was just like something wrong with Black people, right? And I think that was a political narrative, but it was also one that we didn't have a good answer for. And so what I want young people to see is that there are structural reasons for the things that they see in their neighborhoods and in their communities and on the news every day. There are historical reasons. And that ultimately is hopeful to me, because if decisions by powerful people have made the world and its dysfunction that we see today, then better decisions by more people, by fairer-minded people, can make a better world. And it's not hopeless.
Absolutely. So you've offered us hope. You've offered us tangible ways that our current situations connect to our history. So, in that, giving us the cost that what racism costs us all, you're stepping in now to the YA space, which is a minefield. I know firsthand. welcome, right? So I have to ask you now, as my fellow YA author, what is your perspective on the cost of book bans specifically?
I was like, where is he going? I have some thoughts.
That's what we're here for. Yes,
I definitely have some
looking
thoughts.
forward to it.
So, in the book, I talk about three core ideas. The zero-sum lie, right? The lie that there can be no mutual progress, that progress for people of color has to come at the expense of white people. The second big idea is drained pool politics, that racism ultimately stops the majority of white Americans from being as supportive as they otherwise would be of collective solutions, of public goods, public pools in the historical example, but public everything today, right? And third, the idea of the solidarity dividend, the gains that we can unlock when we come together across lines of race. And, I actually think that those three concepts have been really helpful for me in understanding what's going on with the book bans and with these attacks on our children's freedom to learn. Because first of all, the story that the right wing is selling is that it is a zero sum, right? It's Black history versus American history. And all of this expanding of the aperture, this bringing in of new voices is taking something away from white people, from white history, from America. And so it's not a like, oh, this is great, we know more things. It's no, this is a threat, right? So there's this real zero-sum narrative to it. And obviously that's a lie, right? Because it's not a zero-sum, and Black history is U.S. history, and in fact it's all of our shared history. And if you are robbed of that shared history, then you are easily manipulated. You're vulnerable to, whatever demagogue and propaganda comes next. And then the second idea ultimately really gets at the economic agenda behind it, which is that this is a drained pool strategy. Because what it's doing is saying to public libraries and public schools, watch out. It's saying we want to terrify white suburban and rural parents about what's in these public goods, these public schools and public libraries. We don't want you to send your kids to them. We want you to be worried about them. We want to create a chaos so that school librarians have to take every book off the shelf, and then some, angry, person who is watching too much cable news and spending too much time on the dark web gets to be the one to decide which books go back on the shelves, right? That creates chaos. It literally, in some instances, because some of these laws across the country have financial implications, right? If you violate these laws, your budget for the district gets cut, right? It is a drained pool strategy. It's saying this integrated public good is dangerous for white people, and therefore let's stop funding it. Let's stop supporting it. Let's throw it into chaos. Let's weaken it. Now, why? I mean, for some people, it's like, oh, of course, the wealthy, self-interested elite doesn't want public goods. But we should tease that out, right? Like, why, right? There's a lot of money to be made in private schools, right? If we fully privatize all education in this country, not only will it be bad for our democracy and integration and all of that, but it's a huge profit center. And, of course, if we don't have well-funded public goods on the spend side of the ledger, then there's no reason for taxes to be high, right? There's no reason for redistribution. There's no reason for a well-funded government. And so it really is a drained pool strategy. And I think, educators and librarians are seeing that for what it is. They feel like this is not just about the content of books. This is about the fundamental question of whether we're going to have well-funded public goods, public schools, public libraries, and that's how they see it, and that's what they're saying to me. And then finally, I think it is a solidarity dividend because, not the book bans obviously, but the opposite, in that this is, lots of folks say it's a backlash, right? This is a backlash to the racial justice uprising. That makes it sound like it's like a, sort of grassroots kind of natural thing.
Right.
I think it's a sabotage, right? It's a sabotage from on high of something that has been built. And what has been built in this country is an anti-racist majority, a multiracial majority that rejected the politics of divide and conquer, did it again 2 years later in the midterm. And, right now the majority of white Republicans think that police brutality is a major issue and that it's a major issue of systemic racism, right? So we have built something, and the Solidarity Dividend has been a more empathetic, more knowledgeable, more aware population that is asking the right questions about our own history. It's like, this is our history. This is who we are. Don't rob us of this. And so this is a sabotage of the Solidarity Dividend of, a freedom to learn, more empathy, and understanding, which of course is necessary for a functioning democracy.
So well said. So well said. Yeah, it's okay. That's what we are here to clap for Heather. Yes, we are here for that. So you mentioned a key word that I think is extremely important in any anti-racist work, and that's empathy, right? Now, something that you did that I think is just brilliant, right? You are an academic, you are a historian, but one of the things about your books, that they're extremely vulnerable. Right? You give us you, quite frankly, right? Like when I read your words, I feel like I'm getting to know you as a person. And that's an extension also of your podcast, right? Where you went around and you gave us you, right? I know that when I watch you, when I listen to you, I'm getting Heather. What makes you bring that vulnerability to your work as opposed to solely being an academic and a historian?
I've never gotten that question.
I tried.
I was not prepared for that question. It's funny. I just hear my beloved editor of the adult book, Christopher Jackson, who was on many versions of the book saying, I need more Heather here. We've gone 20 pages without Heather. I need more Heather. And it was, pulling teeth, right? It really was. It was hard for me to be like, oh, yeah, okay, fine. Like, I will talk about myself. I will put, how I reacted to this. And it was it's night and day from, early drafts to the final version. I think ultimately there is something about my personality, my character, that is reflected in the spirit of the book. And thank you for mentioning the podcast, also called The Sum of Us, which is really an audio documentary, amazing team, Higher Ground and Futuro Media, of stories of cross-racial solidarity across the country. I think there is something about the way I'm really want an intellectual answer to things. I want to get to the root of things, but for a nerd, I really love people. I really do. I just love being around people. I'm an extrovert. I love all kinds of different people. I love walking into sort of any room, as I did all across the country in the journeys to write the podcast, to do the podcast and the book. I found myself in really strange places and, kind of like a journalist, which I'm not, but that sort of I want to talk to you. I want to know your story. I'm interested in you. It is probably reflective of that kind of heart-mind duality and the affection and patience that I have for people wherever they are on the spectrum of waking up. I wrote the book to persuade. The young adult book, I assume that people don't know what I'm about to say, and they may not agree. They have no reason to agree. They don't know yet. Sometimes I get the question well, how are you tired of doing all this emotional labor of telling white people things they're supposed to already know? And, it's well, first of all, I didn't know most of this stuff before I started researching this book. So we are all woefully miseducated about our own history. And second of all, it's like asking a school teacher, are you tired of teaching a kid to read? Are you tired of teaching someone calculus? Are you tired of teaching? It's like, no, it's about teaching. And not everybody has that predilection for being an educator and gets as excited about seeing someone absorb and the light go on and all that. But I find it energizing, not at all draining.
I love that. So you mentioned teachers. Now, my view on teachers oftentimes is that teachers are the gatekeepers of our future, right? Quite frankly, a great teacher can absolutely change the entire world. But you can't be a great teacher without also being a dreamer. And I remember someone said to me once, my editor actually, she said to me, I was writing my adult work and I was also working on my young adult work at the exact same time. She said, what I'm missing in your young adult work right now is dreaming, right? She's like, in your adult work, you're meant to tell people what is. And in your young adult work, you're meant to tell people what can be. And I think that, again, you've done a wonderful job of that in both books. But I'm interested in what keeps you dreaming to allow other people to dream.
He's good, isn't he? Yeah, there. I think the more I know, this is maybe a little contradictory, but the more I know about the depth of the depravity of our racist history, the extent of it, right? The like every single aspect of life, extent of it. I'm not gonna pretend like it's not emotional or difficult or all of that. And sometimes, it's like I need a walk. But it is empowering because it feels like it was the world that we have today, with all of its head-scratching inequalities and dysfunctions, is the result of deliberate, maniacal insanity, right? Of depravity, of almost every single aspect of our politics, our culture, for most of our history being guided by a lie. And that lie is the lie of a belief in a hierarchy of human value. And, it reached, into women's bodies. It reached into the practice of dentistry. It reached into, how big lawns could be and how big houses could be in the judicial system and, right? I mean, everything, right? And so, in some ways, the more I replace what I grew up with, and I think a lot of us around our age grew up with, was just sort of like, well, we fixed it in the civil rights movement, and now things just are really terrible. There's still the ghetto. It's even worse than it was before. It's sort of inexplicable, right? And the only answer for why there are these inequalities is there just must be something wrong with us. Replacing that with a real understanding of the depth of the design makes me feel, again, like really, like, okay, if some, and we can sort of name them, and, I think Kendi's Stamped from the beginning does a really good job of, like, literally just, like, naming the people who had this ideology and how they perpetuate it through history. If the world we're in now was the dream of some really depraved people, another world can be the dream of us. And that's really empowering to me. It really replaces a sense of hopelessness that I think was sort of the dominant feeling of many of us in the 80s and 90s, was like, things are just worse and getting worse, and there's no explanation for it.
Wow. I'm going to actually take some of that. I'll give you credit. I'll give you full credit, but
I want to be clear. The goal of, an author with an argument is that, people are just saying it like it's common sense and they don't have to attribute it to me. So take it. Don't worry about it.
So one of the things I want to ask you about, because it's interesting, actually, your first book and my first book came out the same year, I believe. Did it just come out
21.
21,
Yeah,
okay.
February
So
21.
mine came out a few months beforehand. And so it was interesting. Someone asked me, and I want to ask you, the book you wrote on the heels of summer 2020, how would you have written that book differently years removed from the summer of 2020?
I can tell you exactly how, because I started writing it years removed from the summer of 2020, right? So I sold the book proposal for the book in 2016, right?
Yeah.
Right, I think. So my kind of outline and my, early drafts of things, it had a lot more like Racism 101 that I ended up having to have. It was very liberating, like as the conversation was developing, the Trump era created more of a clarity around the persistence of racism and, we are humans and we're Americans, so we like a drama and we like a villain, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, there's a villain now in our time, racism must still be here and white supremacy is on the rise, and so that actually changed a lot of things. And then, of course, the summer of 2020, for example, I interviewed Robin DiAngelo a few times over the course of writing the book, because I felt like some of the things that she wrote about kind of the way that white people's minds are impacted by racism and sort of, racial conflict were really important for understanding the kind of psychological costs of racism, not just to people of color, but to white people as well. And by the time I was in the final drafts of the book, I was like, oh, I don't have to do all, like, people have already heard about white fragility, like, I don't have to do it, she's a multi-week best-selling book. I don't need to give her these pages, in my book, right? And then I just kept one story from her, which was a story about her own childhood that I'd never heard anywhere else, that I thought was really interesting, right? So there was a sort of like leveling up of the entry point almost every month, right? Because Chris wrestled the final draft out of my hands right after the election was called for Biden in November 9th. It was like Monday, November 9th, after that amazing weekend. And so much had happened. And it really was like down to the wire. And I remember being kind of sad that my book wasn't out for that summer and to be a part of that conversation. But then ultimately, it really was a book that came out right at the beginning of the Biden administration, and really in a time where people were looking at solutions. And so it landed where it needed to land, I think.
So one of the things that I feel like, every answer that you give is just brilliant. It's a masterclass. Trust me. Like I've been up here and I don't answer like that. But one of the things I do feel like you skirted around a little bit, just a smidgen now. When I was asking you what keeps you dreaming, you gave me an answer that only a brilliant woman such as yourself would give. But what I'm actually more interested in is not the academic historian. I want to know Heather a little bit, right? What keeps you dreaming when you're not in front of people, right? Who are you otherwise?
You sound like my editor. I think it's a few people in my life, right? I think it's my mom, who we just actually made an agreement on our my next book, which is going to be a book that we write together. And she's this extraordinary woman. Hi, Mom. I think she's watching on YouTube from her phone. She's this incredibly syncretic thinker who's, every room in her house looks like this bookstore. She just has an extraordinary mind, and is also one of the most gentle, sensitive, nurturing people you could ever meet. And I think she's like in this world but not of it. And I think she just has this sense of like the long view of everything. She sort of otherworldly. And so that helps me get out of when I talk to her, and also having been raised by her, it just helps me feel like this is, this is fixable. Like this, this is a small thing in the speck of universal talk, right? It's just sort of, she has this spirit about her. It's always looking for the positive, always sort of relentlessly kind of trying to elevate the conversation, get to the place where you are not on your opponent's terrain, where you're speaking from the place, the desired state. She often talks about, like, let's be in the desired state, which can be really annoying, but it's also brilliant, of course. And then now, of course, I have a child, right? And he's this crazy creature that has come through my husband and me into the world, and is so all love. It's just like a total lover, and being excited about his life and the way he connects to people, and just sort of watching him interact with the world is like a huge impact, which he is. It just keeps me feeling like, yeah, we can fix this. We can get stuff out of his way, or he'll have a lot to do, right? He and his peers will have a lot to do with making this world a better place.
That's what I was
That's what you're looking for.
Absolutely lovely. So I think that both your books, right? I actually thought that your first book could definitely be something that young people can and should read. But what you've done is just masterful with this second book, this Young Readers Edition. What were the books that helped kind of build you, right? Like, who were the authors? What were the books as a young person, or even now?
That's a great question. It's funny to be in this young reader space and to be spending time, as I have already for the last week that the book's been out, and I'm hitting the road again later this week, in schools, right? I've been to high schools and middle schools and school libraries, and it's really great because I've never loved books more than I did when I was that age, right? When I was like a middle schooler. I always had a book in my hand. I remember being in the back, I was reading everywhere. Like, it was like, I just always had a book in my hand. I remember being in the back seat of cars at night and trying to read as the like street light would go by. So it sort of looked like a sort of Xerox, right? This like light going past. And I was like, yep. And it was the great young adult books, right? It was Where the Red Fern Grows and Bridge to Terabithia, and the Madeleine L'Engle books. And I really loved Mists of Avalon, which really got me into like feminist, oh, God's not God, God's a goddess. This makes so much more sense, I just loved I loved historical fiction. I loved, basically my thing was books that were not really in this world, right? Speculative fiction, fantasy, sci-fi, historical fiction, where I got to go on a journey. Those were all really important to me. And then, I stopped reading fiction for a long time because I worked in a think tank. And so what I read was the news, and Bureau of Labor Statistics reports, and sometimes big books by, economists and other authors. And, there are a lot of books, nonfiction books, that are very important to the sum of us, like The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. There's something about housing in virtually every chapter of the book. But yeah, I loved books when I was 11, 12 years old. They were my best friend, And I have no intent, I have no dreams that this dry, compelling, human, but still, book is going to be that kind of a book for a young person. But I wish I'd had something like that as a young person, because I was a social justice nerd. I did want to know. And so I'm really excited. I've already gotten feedback from young people, and it's been so fun and gratifying, even just a weekend. So
Yeah, so it's funny. I was going to say it's such a tool that you're equipping people with, right? Like from parents to educators and now young people. What aspect of the book do you hope that young people pull the most from, though?
I think the hopeful aspect of the book is the most important thing to me. In fact, so the young adult book is about a third shorter. And that's not just because there are not 130 pages of endnotes as there are in the adult book. Um, they just cut all that out. I was like, but how, okay. But so it's about a third shorter. And so as I was like going back and forth with my amazing editor, Beverly, at Delacorte, in some ways, there's like the big argument, there's the history, there's the data, and then in every chapter, there's stories. There are stories of a family that really illustrates what I'm talking about. And I try to end each chapter with a hopeful story. And in some ways, the easiest thing to cut out are those stories, right? Because it's like the point has been made, and I'm just doing this sort of illustrative thing. And, at one point, I was like, okay, meta comment. Every chapter still has to end with hope. You can try to cut it down, but it still has to end with that hopeful story. And B, if I have to lose some history for one of the sort of iconic stories in any chapter, I'd rather do that. Because the stories are what stays with people. The story of the drained pool, the story of the Tomlins, the elderly couple, in the financial crisis chapter, right? We could lose some of the explication around derivatives and credit default swaps, but Janice and Isaiah Tomlins need to still be there, and their full story needs to be there. And so that hopeful piece, which is, I think, one of the things that sets the book apart from other books about race and racism, this real conviction that I have, that I hope comes through in the book, that another way is possible, is of course so important for young people, right? Because their timeline is so different, right? They were kind of born in Obama, and then things have just like gotten more and more complex, and the onion's been peeled, that it's not all rosy. That's been their trajectory. Whereas I feel like our trajectory was one where it was like up to Obama, right? It was like civil rights movement, like up to Obama, right? So there was a sense of like, well, yes, there's been some backsliding, but we know that progress is our assumption. And for many young people today, progress is not the assumption at all. And the more they learn, and of course they have access to every piece of information we do now, which is different. We didn't, as kids, have the same information access as our parents did. It can be really dispiriting, right? We've all seen the studies about the anxiety and the depression, and we all know young people who are doing that. So I was like, this book has to give them hope about this most intractable issue, which people say. And I'm like, don't say it's intractable. Like, what are you doing? It's not intractable. It's been with us for a long time, but, we can fix it if we put our minds to it.
Right. Oh, so beautifully said. So I want to go to Q&A in a second, but we've been talking about hope so much, right? And actually, before I get into hope, I want to actually I want to pitch something else pertaining to your book, right? Like for anyone watching, for anyone who doesn't have it yet, I also think this book is really important in the age of disinformation, right? That's one of the things I thought about with your first book, and then as I was reading this one, because something I've found is that a lot of parents are actually the obstacle, right, for a lot of young people being better, quite frankly. And I think what your book offers that many books don't, it offers real life context for how these things are manifesting, but then the historical facts as to how they're manifesting, right? So that's my own little pitch for any educators watching this, any parents watching this, but to leave us with hope, right? My sister, in all things writing and all things change, what right now is filling your cup? I'm not interested in any of the academic things. I'm not interested in any of those. I want to know what's filling your cup. Why are you hopeful?
So in 2022, from like January to May, I spent almost every week back out on the road. And I did it because I felt like there was more to explore, and this idea of the Solidarity Dividend, which is the third big idea in the book, I kind of like hint at it. It's the title of the last chapter. I give a few Solidarity Dividend stories in the book, but to be honest, I was kind of like, you know, the researcher in me wanted more evidence. You know, it was me making the argument that there is a gain for everyone to be had through cross-racial coalition building, through coming together across lines of race, that it can be a win-win. And it was sort of like a theory that I put out there. And the stars lined up. The wonderful people at the Obama's production company thought this was hope and change was something they wanted to talk about and you know, produce something that spoke to it. And so I went back out on the road in search of more stories of hope and solidarity. And I thought it would be harder than it was. We had like too many stories. And these are like complex, like the formula was like, it has to be in a place that's been shaped by racism. And there's a cross-racial coalition that addresses an issue that is, you know, systemically racist, but impacts everyone. And the group, everyone has a discourse about how race is playing in, and they have to win, and you know, and there were so many, and I will say, for some people whose main interaction with the rest of this country is online, it is much better out there than it is in here in your phone, and going out and meeting people, so many of whom have been fundamentally changed by the summer of 2020, right? We can be very cynical. We're like, well, you know, the coffee shops don't have BLM signs in them anymore. What happened? But people, as I'm sure many of the people in this room and watching this were fundamentally changed by that largest social demonstration movement in history. And so the journey that I took to do the podcast introduced me to ordinary people who did extraordinary things, inspired to address racism in their communities. And the fact that that is a sort of subterranean story going on amidst all the, you know, the stories of division and the kind of rubbernecking that we have about, oh my God, I can't believe they did this, and I can't believe this atrocious thing, and I can't believe this. You know, we're so addicted to the terrifying news, the dispiriting news, the I can't believe it news. But, you know, underneath, the reason why the right wing is so focused on stopping us from thinking things and saying things is because they know that everything we believe comes from a story we've been told. And as this society has been opening the aperture to more stories and more truths, people are forever changed. And that gives me a lot of hope. And that's not something that can be taken away. People don't go back to sleep, you know?
Well, I think that we are in a room with a bunch of people who are not going back to sleep. So I would love to hear from some of you. I've asked many questions. So let's get started. Oh, okay. You were the first one, so please.
Do they need a mic so that people can hear? Or I'll repeat it. Okay. Hi. Thank you.
We're going to call you YA Heather. So 2 quick, concise questions. One is, I'm thinking about a neighbor who bought a brownstone on my block, and he works at BlackRock. And so the question with him is, with the solidarity dividend that you're talking about, people who understand BLM, they're against police brutality, but they don't want to give up all this profit that you beautifully outlined in terms of private schools, private this, private that. Like, how come they don't see half the equation that you're trying to draw? They are against the interpersonal racism, but they're not buying your class argument. That's the first question. And the second question is, how can we get politicians to tell the hopeful narrative that you're telling? The conservatives have a concise narrative. China did this to you. Mexico's doing this to you. How come Democratic politicians can't get the concise narrative that you have that inspires people?
Thank you, Rich. Rich Benjamin, wonderful author, Searching for Whitopia and other books to come, for example. Yes. So, real talk, people love having money. I was in I gave, as you know, as Frederick said, sometimes you get invited to corporate rooms to talk about this stuff, right? So I was at a breakfast in Vermont of a sort of Vermont kind of business council. So this isn't like, BlackRock, but these are all like, small and medium-sized businesses in Vermont, all white, except for maybe 3 people, overwhelmingly male. And, my message is like, there's a corporation in every chapter. It's always the villain. I'm saying like more government money, higher taxes, refill the pool of public goods, So they were like really with me as I can get like a crowd of white, moderates with me. And, but then someone said, well, aren't you really just saying, raise their money, said, aren't you really just saying that we should throw more money at the problem? And I was kind of like, you got me, And I said, I completely understand, government does not always do everything right. Like any institution, there can be waste, fraud, and abuse, but I don't know about you, but I found in my life, more money has solved a lot of problems. And they were all like, right? Of course more money solves problems, right? We're talking about things like the child tax credit, like $250 a kid for families that are struggling. It's just this, I hope that the economic piece that says that poverty is unacceptable in a country with our wealth, that once you've gone through the arguments of the way in which poverty has been manufactured, the way in which wealth has been systematically subsidized in one part of our society and stripped from another part of our society, and you begin to undo some of the stereotypes about poor people's behavior and choices, you begin to have, and I think the pandemic also really helped with this, just a leveling up of the sense that actually there is a floor below which no family should ever fall. As I write in the book, in 1956 and 1960, nearly 70% of white Americans believed that there should be a guaranteed income. Right? That used to be like, sure, the government should do that. Guarantee a job for anyone who couldn't find one in the private sector. And so, do I think that your BlackRock neighbor, believes that there should be the same amount of financial regulation that I do? I don't know. But I think some of the things that used to be outside of the confines of polite conversation about poverty have evolved and have changed. And honestly, the American public, including many Republicans, are ahead of where Washington is and ahead of where the Conservative Party is on those issues. And then your second question was a very good one that I don't remember.
Why can't the politicians?
Oh, I mean, that's like, there's like the part of it is because the message is populist. It really is, right? It's not saying we should just all get along and there should be racial equity. It's saying actually that there's a self-interested narrow elite that is using racism to further their greed. And it's a populist message, and that's not that comfortable for many progressives and Democrats. And then the ones for whom it is comfortable are people like Sanders and Warren and, like our most populist politicians are white and like quite white, right? I mean, you know what I mean? Like our, and so the sort of ability to deftly talk about race in a way that's not like the safest thing to say about race, because it's not actually the safest thing to say about race, to say that it is it's being used to further greed, right? That there's racial inequity and systemic racism is the safest thing to say about race in there, right? So I think that's part of it. It's populist, and then the populism often wants to be a colorblind populism.
I need more questions. That was phenomenal. That was better than any question that I asked. So, more questions. Okay. You go first, and then we'll have you go second.
I have been a high school teacher my whole life, and I read.
She said, I have been a high school teacher my whole life.
No, but I loved your first book, but it was hard for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this possibility of reaching kids by saying you have to talk to people, you have to write your story, people have to listen to your story, is really the way to open the eyes of kids to be more hopeful, not to fill them, unfortunately, with all the stuff that you know, because nobody's as smart as Heather is, but to have them get a chance to struggle with things and say, this is kind of uncomfortable. And as you have gone out as a black woman into areas where people must have been surprised that you're willing to talk to them. And that would be the same for kids, especially if you have kids I was teaching in a privileged public school. How do I get kids in that school to hear other voices and to write other voices? So I'm hoping that this would be a guide and a model for teachers, and I'm wondering if you're encouraging teachers to write, this is how I will teach this book kind of things.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. So I really how these young adult books get out in the world is through educators and librarians, right? It's not actually so many middle schoolers who are picking up this book when, like, if you look at the young adult section back there, it is really exciting, you know? And so, you know, in some ways, educators and librarians are the audience. And there is an educator's guide that was created by a lifelong educator that is on the website, you know, and you can, I think it's linked on the Amazon page and everything. But what I'm also excited about is seeing educators and librarians do what's been done for the adult book with book clubs, which is like creating their own. Right? Creating their own guides and lesson plans and doing that in a really open source way. I'm super excited about that conversation. And let me tell you, I just tried to kind of teach my book for 45 minutes to a group of middle schoolers, and it was not easy. I was like, okay, you know, like, so let's go back to the pool. All right. But they got it, right? Like, I mean,
or they'll begin to get it.
Yeah.
It's not like they're going to get it, but if you write your story and you heard somebody else who had a hard time writing their story, but you heard something, just even those little steps will move you forward with kids and being able to be open to the bigger, harder questions.
Yeah, I really love that idea of sort of like what are the writing prompts that come from the book for students.
That's brilliant. There was a question here in the middle. Hi.
We have time for one more. Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to ask you to contrast your book to the 1619 project. Because you were so optimistic and the 1619 is so pessimistic.
So the 1619 project, I mean, I remember that's another book that came out, you know, as I was writing, and I was kind of like, oh, okay, like a few of the things I was trying to say for the first time, you know, in this era are being covered there. I have tremendous respect for the 1619 project. And actually, you know, in reading it, not just like, you know, the like personality and the, you know, controversy and stuff like that, in reading the magazine, which just did tremendous. I mean, the New York Times has never had anything like that in terms of just like mass demand for the magazine issue. And then the book, which came out last fall, also from One World, my great adult editor at a publishing house. It is tremendously nuanced and I think kind of a similar sense when you read it of like the extent of the impact of racist thinking and racist policymaking on all these fields of our work, but also the extent of the contributions of Black people, to all of these areas. And so I don't find the actual text pessimistic. I think a lot of the like conversation around it and the like, tweet threads and stuff like that can feel more pessimistic. But I actually don't find the actual text pessimistic. I'm not an historian. I include history in the book because I think you have to know a little bit about the steps that got you there to understand like where you're standing today. But it's sort of like history just for context to talk about the economy today. And I think that's a big difference between the 1619 project, which is really an historical project. And then, my goal is really to look at solutions for the future, right? What are the solutions that we can gather around and recognize that there are common solutions to our common problems? And the emphasis on the Solidarity Dividend and on collective action, is really kind of, I hope, practical. It's the main goal of the Sum of Us is not to teach us something different about our history, but rather to inspire us to do something different for our future.
Okay, that is all for questions. Heather, thank you for allowing me to sit up here with you. You are absolutely magnificent. Can we please get a round of applause for Heather?
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, Frederick Joseph. Buy all of his books. Buy all the books in this bookstore. Thank you, Books Are Magic.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you, Freda, again, for moderating this fantastic conversation. And thank you all so much for coming out tonight and asking brilliant questions as well. So, as I said earlier, Heather will be sticking around to personalize books. All of the books are pre-signed. So if you're good with just a signature, then, you're welcome to be on your way. If you'd like it personalized to a specific name, we'll have you all line up down the center aisle and turn around to the little alcove where my coworker Jenny is pointing to. I also want to plug our year-long reading challenge, I Read Black Authors, especially since we have a new challenge for young readers. And so for all of you out in the audience, if you read either one of these authors' books, not only will you learn so much new information and gain so much new knowledge, you can also win some free pizza. Adults, unfortunately, you only get a 20% off discount at the end of the year, but that's still a good one. So grab those cards on your way out as well. And of course, we have plenty of additional copies available for purchase tonight of both Heather's book as well as some of Fred's. Okay, that's all. Let's give these two one last round of applause.